run out there with them real quick and get them signed up and come back in here. Yep, that's yours. We do kids ministry a little bit differently here. So we used to have kind of a traditional Sunday school model where the kids went, kind of before worship. We had Sunday school classes and kids went there. And then we figured out when we were doing that, this was years ago, we got about 50% participation when we were doing that. And that's pretty good. If you come from Sunday school churches, it's like 50, 60%. That's pretty good. When we switched and started doing it at the same time as worship, we got nearly 100% participation out of our kids' ministry, which was awesome, and we loved that. But then a few years ago, we're like, wait a minute, I don't know that we want our kids going the whole time. I don't know if we want them completely missing worship and just being in Sunday school the whole time. And so we kind of adopted this model we've got today where our preschoolers go the whole time, and then once they hit kindergarten, they come in to worship with their families, and they're here for the singing. And then the part of the service that they are least likely to engage with, which is me, and my feelings are not hurt by that, but the part of the service they're least likely to engage with, then they go to Sunday school, and they've got age-specific Bible study and teaching there. And then once they hit 5th grade, they can go to student ministry, except in our student ministry, we do that only in the second service because community is super important. Once you hit those junior high school years, community is super, super important. And so we want all our students to be in the same service together. So we move them all to second service once they hit that 5th grade. And then even then, we have some parents or some kids that are like, I like being in the worship service. I like participating in the sermon. And that's fine because we do student ministry on Wednesday nights and Sunday nights too. So it's kind of a little bit of a hybrid model where we're trying to kind of keep the families intact, let our kids experience multi-generational worship, but then let them experience kind of age-specific teaching and Bible study. And it's been a while since I've explained that, and we've got a bunch of new folks. Like the last few Sundays, I've met a lot of new folks, and I've had a few questions about children's ministry, and I thought it's probably a good time to explain that. So I just kind of want to explain what was going on when we say kids dismissal. Because if I forget to mention it, it's kind of weird because you sit down and 90 kids get up and run out of the room. It's like, what's this guy going to say? But anyway, that kind of stuff is kind of what we go over in step 1. So if you're new to Murray Hills and you're interested in learning more about what do we do and why do we do it and what do we believe and what do we practice, we go over all of that in step 1. And that's we feed you lunch. We got childcare provided. I talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. 25 sometimes, and just kind of tell you a little bit about the church, and then we do question and answer. So anyway, today we're starting a new series. Today we are jumping into the Gospel of Mark. It's a series called Simply Jesus, and the Gospel of Mark is my second favorite gospel, and that's no offense to Mark at all. He's written a good gospel, but Luke is my favorite. I won't go into all the reasons why Luke is better than Mark, but Mark is my second favorite, and it's a really, really good gospel. And I want to talk a little bit about why we're going to do this, kind of how we got to this series and why I chose the Gospel of Mark, and then I'm going to do just a little bit of an introduction to the Gospel of Mark today. But I had something totally different planned for this August. As late as June, I had a totally different series lined out in August. And we kind of did something last fall that I had never done before, and that's we did a 16-week series last fall, or maybe it was 18 weeks. I can't remember. It actually went into the new year just a little bit. And so we did the book of Romans. And most of my series are 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and I wanted to do Romans, and it's like there's no way you can teach Romans in 4 weeks. There's no way you can teach it in 8 weeks. So you're going to have to do a long series if you want to do Romans. And so we did this long series. It took us all the way through the end of the year, and I liked it. I enjoyed that. I liked kind of having a text, and that's the text we're going to do this week, and then the next Sunday, that's the text we're going to do. I kind of enjoyed it. And it breaks all the rules of modern preaching. I'm going to say modern preaching because everybody now, if you watch these church consultants on TikTok or Instagram or whatever, they're like, people's attention spans are getting shorter. They're getting shorter. You gotta cut those sermons off, get them shorter because, when I started preaching, it was a 22-minute attention span. You know why? That's what I learned in college was you got to preach 22-minute sermons because the average length of a sitcom is 22 minutes when you take the commercials out. So you got to preach. That's what people's attention span is. And I'm like, if that's the rule of thumb, what do we do in the era of TikTok? and of Instagram Reels and of YouTube Shorts. Like my sermons would be 1 minute long, and I would just sit down. And some of you would be like, hey, I don't see anything wrong with that. But like we assume that people just can't absorb information. People just can't sit for long periods of time and absorb a lot of information. Yet at the same time, we're in this TikTok generation. Podcasts are more popular than ever before, and those things are like an hour to an hour and a half long. I'm listening to one right now. It's 2 hours long. And I'm like, what do you have to talk about for 2 hours? But I'm listening to all 2 hours of it because it's interesting enough that so we can engage for longer periods of time. So I'm kind of like, yep, we're going to buck the rules a little bit, and we're just going to talk about Mark through the rest of this year. And I think that's 19 weeks. So I'm going to beat my last series and make this my longest series. So we're going to talk about Mark through the rest of the year. The other reason I want to do this, though, is because I got to thinking about, like, what do we need as a church? If I'm thinking about teaching and planning this, where are we in this season of our church life, and what do we need? And I got to thinking about Hope Center, and we just opened up Hope Center, and we're having a lot of new families coming in with Hope Center. What's unique about Hope Center is it's not just the guys who worship with us, but their families are welcome to worship with us as well. And so we got a lot of new folks coming into the church. I'm meeting a lot of people that are moving to Tennessee. Tennessee's still a popular destination, and Columbia is still a pretty popular destination as well. So I'm meeting a lot of new families that are coming in that are wanting to know a little bit, like, what is this church about? Who are you guys? You know, they've seen a little bit online, but who are you guys? And then I just got to thinking about the culture in general. And the culture in general, biblical illiteracy is pretty high right now because there's a lot of kids that didn't grow up going to kids ministry or didn't grow up going to Sunday school, and so you don't know a whole lot about the Bible, and we get our information in 30-second bits. That's where we get our news. We get our news from TikTok, or we get our news from Instagram, in these little 30-second bits. And there's a lot of weird stuff on the internet. There's a lot of crazy, and I'm talking about Christian stuff. I'm not talking about all the other weird stuff. I'm talking about Christian stuff because the algorithms must read my bio and know that I'm a pastor, and so they feed me a lot of Christian content. They feed me a lot of sermons from other pastors. They feed me a lot of worship services, and about half of it's just weird. I'm like, what in the world? Some of it I'm like, oh, this is one of those spoof accounts. This is one of those parody accounts. And I'll click it, and I was like, no, that's his account. He shared it. He thinks this is a good clip. It's just weird. And there's one I just started following. I was going to show you some clips, but I was like, it'll just get me in trouble. So you got to watch them on your own. It's called The Holy Nope. I don't know if you've seen this guy on Instagram, but it's a guy, and he's at a church, it's an empty church, and he sits down, he goes, got my Bible, it's the Lord's day, I'm ready to hear the word. And then he does a clip of a crazy church service. And after about 30 seconds, he goes, nope. And it's a great account. He's way more theologically conservative than I am, because I've listened to some of his sermons, and I'm like, I don't know if I agree with it. But it's a funny account, because he's just kind of taking what's out there and going like, there's some really, really weird stuff out there. And I thought, okay, what if we just did a novel thing? What if we just opened up the Bible every week and talked about Jesus? Let's just do that through the rest of the year. Because we got a lot of new folks that may not know who Jesus is. We got a lot of folks who may feel like you know who Jesus is, or there may just be a lot of confusion about who Jesus is because you see all this weird stuff on the internet, and it's like, who is this? Who is Jesus? And what did he do? And what did he say? And why does it matter? And that's what we're going to learn about in the Gospel of Mark. And that's why I'm calling it Simply Jesus, because I want it to be simply a focus on Jesus and who he is. And the reason I chose Mark for that is because it's the shortest gospel. It is the shortest gospel. Okay? I don't like, when I'm reading something, I don't like a lot of words. You don't need to take 10 pages to describe one character, or 15 pages to describe what this one character did. And I'm looking at you, Victor Hugo, and other people like that. And I love Les Mis, but you can get too wordy. And Mark doesn't get too wordy. Mark is 16 chapters, barely 16, 678 verses. He uses 8,000 less words than Matthew, 6,000 less words than Luke, and 4,000 less words than John. And so Mark is just like short and to the point. Like, here's the facts, here's who Jesus is, here's what you need to know, and he just like jumps straight into it. Mark is a book that if you don't like to read, Mark is the gospel for you. Because you can read it in one sitting. I mean, you're probably not going to, but you can read it in one sitting. Like, you're like, I don't really like to read. I'm not really a reader. Mark is the gospel. Or if you're wanting to know, like, I just want to know some basics about who Jesus is, Mark is the gospel for you. It's very, and we're going to do this throughout this series. We're going to kind of be going through. I'm not really doing it a chapter at a time because it depends on how the stories flow, but I'm going to give you the reading in advance and say, hey, before next week, read Mark chapter 1. And then we're going to come together and talk about it. And then I hope in your small groups, you're going to talk about it in your small groups, because small groups kick off today. And so most of the small groups, they don't have to do the sermon study. Most of the small groups do the sermon study. So basically, I just want to, like, several months of, like, let's just really intensely focus on who Jesus is. And just give me Jesus, just simply Jesus. Some people will look at Mark, and there's some criticism of it that it's too simplistic. I'm like, that's exactly what I want. I want the simplistic. Just tell me exactly who Jesus is. Just give me the facts here. So let's go into Mark chapter 1. I'm gonna preach one whole verse today. Mark chapter 1, verse 1. And I just want to, like, what I usually do when I teach through a text, like a book, we're going to do a book study, I'll usually take the introduction, because most books of the Bible have a little introduction, like, I, Paul, I'm writing to the Romans, or I, Paul, I'm writing to the church in Ephesus, and, greetings and grace and peace to you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. And, so you get this little bit of information about who's the author and who they're writing to and all that kind of stuff. So I was like, okay, well, today I'm going to talk about the introduction to the book of Mark. So I'm just going to I'm just going to do his introduction. And so here's his introduction. The beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. He doesn't even get a full sentence in the verse. He just, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God, and he jumps straight into the story. There's no birth story in Mark. You don't ever hear Mark preached at Christmas time, because he skips totally over the birth story. There's no genealogies in Mark. He doesn't care about kind of connecting Jesus to his ancestors and showing you this and showing you that. He just there's no, like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word, John uses, a whole chapter to kind of introduce Jesus. Mark just says, here's Jesus. Now, he says a lot in just a little right there. He says this is the beginning. He says it's good news. He says it's about Jesus. He says that Jesus is the Messiah, and he says that Jesus is the Son of God. And then he jumps straight in, like he's got to quickly tell the story. He jumps straight into the story. And as readers, we're looking and going, okay, well, why is this good news? And why is Jesus the Messiah? And what does that mean that Jesus is the Messiah? And why is he the Son of God? Or how do we know he is the Son of God? And Mark starts answering those questions in the first chapter. But, and we'll kind of dig into that as we dig a little bit deeper. But if you want to know more about Mark, you can't learn it from the book. You got to learn it from another book. Okay, so I'll give you this example. If I was to give you a book and say, hey, I ran across this book, I think you really enjoy it, and I gave you a copy of a book to read, most of you would not take it home and sit down and start reading the first chapter. What are you going to do? If somebody gives you a book or recommends a book, or let's say you go to Amazon, you pick out a book and you want to purchase it, what are you going to do? You're going to look and ask a couple of basic questions, and you're going to do it in pretty quick succession. You're going to want to know, who wrote this book? Why did they write it, and what's it about? That's pretty much what you want to know, any book. Who wrote it, why did they write it, and what's it about? And you can find all of that on the jacket of the book. You read the little back of the book. Okay, there's the author. Okay, that's what he wrote about. And they're trying to sell you the book, but it gives you some basic information about the book. Mark doesn't give us that in the book. And there's no jacket covers on, the Gospel of Mark. So we have to dig just a little bit deeper to understand a little bit about what we're getting ready to read. So if you got a good study Bible, you go to the introduction. There's usually an introduction to the book, and we usually skip over that. Don't skip over that. Read the introduction, because the introduction in a study Bible is going to tell you who wrote it, when they wrote it, why they wrote it, what they said in it, that kind of stuff. So you look at that. So I want to give you just a little bit about Mark and what he wrote, okay? So if you open up your study Bible and you open up the introduction and you're going to read about Mark, here's the first thing you're going to learn about this book. Number one, it was probably not written by Mark. What? What do you mean it was probably not? It's got his name on it. Well, it was written by Mark, but let me explain. Mark, there's nothing in the gospel that tells you who wrote it. Like, there's nothing in this gospel. If we just read the gospel, there's nothing that tells us Mark. The only place that his name appears is in the title. Okay, and he didn't title it. We get that it was probably Mark because of church tradition, because of 1st, 2nd, 3rd century church tradition. They generally attributed it to Mark. But they also recognized that Mark was a very close associate, and we do get this out of Scripture. Mark was a very close associate of Peter. And we also know that Peter's sermons are really close to the Gospel of Mark. Like if you look at Acts chapter 2 and the outline of Peter's sermon, that's the first gospel sermon ever preached. You look at Acts chapter 10 and the outline of Peter's sermon, they pretty much follow the outline of the book of Mark. Or, I should say, the book of Mark pretty much follows the outline of Peter's sermons. So what you really got here is that Peter heavily influenced the Gospel of Mark. So you can almost think of it as the Gospel of Peter. He heavily influenced the Gospel of Mark. His sermons probably provided most of the content for the book, and Mark arranged them into the book form that we have today. So he took, the content he's using comes from Peter. Now, why is that important? Why does it matter if Peter wrote it or Mark wrote it? Why is it important? It's important because here's what you got in the Gospel of Mark. You got a firsthand account. You got an eyewitness account. So everything that they tell about Jesus is not coming from somebody who read about Jesus, not coming from somebody who studied Jesus. Luke was a historian, so Luke had to go back and interview the eyewitnesses. But what you've got in Mark is someone who saw it all firsthand. And that's why it may be very action-oriented, because there's not a lot of words, there's not a lot of words in red in Mark, if you will, not like John. But it's very action-oriented. It just goes event to event. Jesus did this, and then Jesus did this, and Jesus did this, and Jesus did this. And so I think of it when I'm reading it, this is Peter recollecting the things that he remembered Jesus doing, and like, this is the stuff you really need to know, and this is the stuff I saw firsthand. There's more miracles in the Gospel of Mark than any of the other Gospels. Why is that? Well, this is a guy who saw them firsthand. If I had seen some of those miracles, that's probably what I would think to write about when I write the book. I mean, those are some pretty incredible things. So these are firsthand eyewitness accounts. Okay. Second thing, and that slide, nobody took a picture of that, right? Because that'll probably get me in trouble on the line. I debated a long time. Do I say it's not written by Mark or do I? Anyway, it was probably the first gospel written. So this gospel was probably written about 50 to 60 AD, which means it was written 20 to 30 years after the death of Jesus. It's probably the first gospel. The reason we think it was the first gospel is because it looks like Matthew, when he wrote his gospel, used Mark. And it looks like Luke, when he wrote his gospel, used Mark. If you ever heard them called the synoptic gospels, that's a big fancy word that I had to look up that means of the same view. And so Matthew, when he had Mark as a source, and Luke had Mark as a source. So that means that Mark was probably the first gospel written. In fact, all but 31 verses out of Mark are repeated in Matthew and Luke. Okay? Third thing you're going to learn, it was probably written near Rome. Well, why do we think that? Well, because around 50 to 60 AD, Peter was in Rome. This would have been just before his death. We know that Mark, if you go in 1 Peter mentions this, and I think Acts mentions this, but you know that Mark was near Rome around this time. And we also have some clues that the gospel was written to Roman Christians, which is, I think, very telling for, like, it's written to Gentiles. It's not written to a Jewish audience. It's written to a Gentile audience. And you got some clues in there, like Mark explains Jewish customs. And Matthew doesn't explain them because he didn't need to, because he's writing to Jewish people. And Mark translates Aramaic words. And, of course, you wouldn't have to do that if you're writing to a Jewish audience. And Mark talks a lot about persecution, which at that particular time, the Roman Christians were facing a lot of persecution. So he talks a lot about persecution. It's almost as if Peter knows that Peter is martyred. It's almost as if he knows that his death is nearing, and I got to put this down on paper. Here's what you need to know about Jesus. Here's what you need to know about who this is, and here's what you need to know about his identity. And the whole identity is rooted in the first verse there, that he's the Messiah, he's the Son of God. And then he says, why do I know he's the Messiah, the Son of God? Because of this story, because of this story, because of this story, because of this story, and it culminates with the resurrection. And so Peter's building his case as an eyewitness who followed this teacher, who followed this rabbi, and through following this rabbi became to believe that he was not just a rabbi, he was the Son of God, he was the Messiah, and he's building his case for why he came to that conclusion. That's why I love this gospel. Like if you're a skeptic going, I don't know, how do you know that Jesus really was the Son of God, or how do you really know that he did the things that he did? This is a great gospel to do that in. The last thing that I'll mention here, and I've already mentioned this one once, but Mark was and is all about action. It's like he's in a hurry to get to the next story. It's just, I want to take you to this story, to this story, to this story, and it's all about Jesus. I want to show you a quote, and I'm going to, in the spirit of Mark, I'm going to end early today. So I want to show you a quote, and we're going to close with a song. But this is from a commentary I was studying this week. That it's a great little description that said the book as a whole is characterized as the beginning. Wait, I missed one. I hit it too quick. Did I delete one of my slides? I did. Oh, no, they're just out of order. Okay. So I was fooling with the computer back there, and I should never fool with the computer. Mark's gospel is a simple, succinct, unadorned, yet vivid account of Jesus' ministry, emphasizing more what Jesus did than what he said. Mark moves quickly from one episode in Jesus' life and ministry to another, often using the adverb immediately. He uses that word 41 times. But here's the one I want you to see. The book as a whole is characterized as the beginning of the good news. The life, death, and resurrection of Christ comprise the beginning of which the apostolic preaching in Acts is the continuation. Now, he's talking about chapter 1, verse 1, that in the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. I've always read that as Mark saying this is about the beginning of Jesus' story. But this guy's saying, no, he's saying that this whole book, this whole story of Jesus, his life, his miracles, his teaching, his death, his burial, his resurrection, this whole story of Jesus is the beginning of the good news. Chapter 2 continues in Acts. Chapter 3 continues in the first century. Chapter 4 continues in the second century, in the third century. Like the beginning, the whole story of Jesus is actually the beginning of the good news. And I like the thinking about it that way because it changes the way that we think about our role in it. In other words, Jesus was not the end of the story. You know, like it began with his birth and it ended with his resurrection. End of story, that's the gospel. No, what Mark is saying is that the beginning of the story is Jesus. The story continues still today. Jesus will write the ending, but the story continues still today. So we are still in the process of writing the story of the gospel. The gospel still continues through us because we are now, it's how do we live our lives? What do our behaviors look like? What do our actions look like? What do our words look like? How are we pointing people to Jesus? What are people reading about Jesus today through our lives as we continue to live out the story of Jesus? What are we building our lives on as we continue to live out the story of Jesus? So I want us to be thinking about that as we get ready to enter into this study together. And that's where your small groups are going to go this week. I just want you to think about this idea that we're the continuation of the story. Jesus was not the end of the story. He was the beginning of the story. When somebody is baptized, we always tell them this is not the end of your journey of faith. This is the beginning of your journey of faith. And so we're still living the story. We're still living out the gospel. Let me say a quick prayer for us, and we're going to close with a song. Father, I pray that you help us to live in such a way that people see Jesus through us, through our words, through our actions, through our behaviors, through our kindness, through our love, our patience, our joy, through our service to others, through our self-control, that people would see Jesus through us as we continue to live out his story. And we're thankful for this beginning. We're thankful that Jesus is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God, and we're thankful that we can build our lives upon his foundation. And it's in his name I pray these things. Amen. Let's stand together and sing this song.